My family laughed first with their eyes before their mouths followed, the kind of laughter that pretends to be polite until it finds courage in wine glasses and silverware clinks, and I watched their gazes slide toward my husband like knives wrapped in smiles, measuring him, shrinking him, deciding his worth in silence before speaking it aloud, and I knew that night would scar something forever because mockery from strangers fades, but ridicule from blood embeds itself in bone, and there he sat. My little husband, as they loved to call him, shoulders slightly hunched not from weakness, but from years of learning how to occupy less space so others could feel taller, his hands folded neatly on his lap as if holding himself together required physical effort. And I loved him in that moment with a violence that scared me, because love that wants to protect can quickly turn into love that wants to destroy, and my family had no idea which one they were awakening. It began with harmless comments, or at least that's how they framed them, questions about his job said with raised brows, jokes about his height disguised as concern, remarks about his silence mistaken for stupidity. And every laugh landed like a slap I felt in my own chest, but he only smiled, that soft, patient smile of a man who had survived worse things than cruel dinners, and I realized then that dignity often looks like weakness to people who have never earned it. My cousin leaned forward, swirling his drink, and said something about how I always aimed high in life and somehow married low, and the table erupted, forks pausing midair as if even the cutlery wanted to hear the punchline again, and I waited. Waited for my husband to respond, but he didn't, because he never fought battles that didn't matter, and that restraint was exactly why they felt safe attacking him, because predators mistake silence for surrender. My mother smiled the way women smile when they want to pretend they raised you better than this, and my uncle added a comment about love being blind but not deaf, and I felt something ancient and cold settle behind my ribs, a promise forming quietly. Because they didn't know who I was anymore, they remembered the version of me that needed approval, not the woman who had learned how power actually works. I squeezed my husband's hand under the table and felt his thumb trace a small circle on my palm, grounding me, trusting me, and that trust became fuel, because revenge born from ego burns fast, but revenge born from love burns clean and long. I excused myself to the restroom, staring at my reflection as the noise of laughter bled through the walls, and I saw two women in the mirror, the daughter they thought they knew and the strategist they had never met, and only one of them was walking back to that table. When I returned, dessert had arrived, sweetness coating cruelty, and my aunt leaned over to ask my husband if he was intimidated sitting among such successful people, and he answered gently that he was grateful to be there. And I watched the way his humility disarmed even as it invited more blows, and I decided then that I wouldn't correct them tonight, because ignorance was more useful than confrontation, and they were giving me everything I needed. Over the following weeks, I smiled at family gatherings, laughed at jokes that weren't funny, listened more than I spoke, because people reveal their ugliest truths when they believe you are harmless, and they believed I was still the girl desperate to prove herself, not the woman quietly moving pieces into place. My husband never asked why I came home silent some nights or why my phone buzzed at odd hours. He trusted me the way you trust the ground beneath your feet, assuming it will hold because it always has. And that trust sharpened my resolve because failure was no longer an option. It would be betrayal. They mocked his income not knowing it was intentionally modest, his position not knowing it was strategic, his quiet not knowing it was calculated, and most dangerously, they mocked me for settling, not knowing I had already risen far beyond their ceiling. The first crack appeared when my cousin's company lost a major investor, an investor who had quietly shifted allegiance weeks earlier, guided by data I had prepared under a different name, and at the next dinner the laughter was thinner, the jokes cautious. And my husband's silence suddenly felt unsettling to them, because power is only funny until it moves. Then my uncle's reputation began to wobble, not from lies, but from truths carefully released into the right ears, truths that had always existed but needed timing to become devastating. And I watched them scramble to control narratives they never knew were being written, while my husband read beside me at night, calm, untouched, because he was never the target, he was the shield. When my mother finally asked me how we were managing so well in uncertain times, I smiled and said, "Love teaches you efficiency," and she nodded without understanding, because people who measure worth in volume never recognize precision. The final dinner came without announcement, summoned by desperation rather than tradition, and they were different then, eyes darting, voices tight, respect arriving too late to be sincere, and my husband sat straighter that night, not because he had changed, but because the room finally had. They asked him questions now, careful ones, and he answered politely, still kind, still humble, and I realized then the cruelest revenge wasn't humiliation. It was forcing them to confront the truth that the man they belittled was the only one among them who never needed to prove anything, and when we stood to leave, my cousin attempted a joke, a weak one, about first impressions. And I met his eyes and said impressions only matter to people who don't control outcomes, and the silence that followed was complete. In the car, my husband thanked me for a nice evening, unaware of the empire of consequences that had collapsed behind us, and I smiled, because the most satisfying revenge is the one your enemies feel but never fully understand, and as we drove away, I knew they would replay every word, every laugh, every insult, searching for the moment they lost, never realizing it was the moment they chose to underestimate love. They thought the silence after that dinner was safety, that distance would soften consequences, but silence is where reckoning sharpens its teeth, and while they whispered among themselves about recovery and regrouping, I was already several steps ahead. Because power doesn't announce itself, it rearranges the room quietly and lets people trip over the new layout. My husband noticed the shift before they did, not in their fortunes, but in my breathing, calmer, steadier, as if a long-held weight had finally been set down, and he asked me one night if everything was okay, and I told him the truth without details, that some debts were finally being paid. And he nodded as if that was enough, because he never needed to know how storms are built, only that the roof would hold. My family's world began to contract in subtle humiliations, invitations that stopped arriving, calls that went unanswered, doors that once opened easily now requiring explanations they didn't have, and watching them struggle wasn't pleasure. It was confirmation, because revenge isn't about enjoying pain, it's about restoring balance, and they had tipped the scale long ago. My aunt attempted reconciliation first, showing up with gifts and rehearsed warmth, praising my husband's manners, his patience, his strength, compliments delivered like bandages over wounds she pretended not to have caused. And my husband accepted them graciously, because forgiveness came easily to him, but forgetting did not come to me, and I realized then that mercy without accountability is just permission in disguise. She asked if I could help smooth things over for the family, said we were all blood after all, and I smiled and said blood is exactly why cuts bleed deepest, and she left confused, because people who rely on family privilege never expect family consequences. My cousin tried charm next, inviting us to events where he could be seen beside us, hoping proximity might restore credibility, and my husband declined politely, saying he preferred quiet evenings, and I watched panic flicker behind my cousin's eyes, because relevance is oxygen to men like him, and he was beginning to suffocate. My mother waited the longest, pride warring with fear, until one afternoon she sat across from me at my kitchen table, the same table my husband and I shared dreams and coffee and silence, and she finally asked the question she'd avoided, "What did you do?" And I answered honestly, "Nothing you didn't teach me." I listened, I observed, I acted when it mattered, and she stared at me as if meeting a stranger, because parents like to believe their children inherit only their virtues, not their weapons. She tried to apologize then, not for mocking my husband, but for underestimating me, and that distinction mattered, because it revealed exactly where her regret lived, and I told her the truth, that respect given late still arrives late, and that some doors close not out of anger but out of necessity. My husband entered the room quietly, sensing tension, and my mother's eyes softened toward him, finally seeing what she had refused to before, a man steady enough to stand beside a woman she could no longer control. And that realization hurt her more than any loss of status. As months passed, the family narrative shifted from mockery to myth. Stories whispered about how we rose so quickly, how luck favored us, how timing saved us, anything to avoid admitting that kindness paired with intelligence is a force they never learned to recognize. My husband remained unchanged, still waking early, still speaking gently, still choosing patience even when strength would have been easier, and that constancy became the final punishment for those who had tried to reduce him. Because nothing infuriates small minds more than dignity that cannot be shaken. One evening, long after the chaos settled, we attended a distant relative's gathering, neutral ground, and I watched my family watch us, cautious now, respectful, measuring every word, and I realized then that fear had replaced mockery. And fear is just respect that arrives too late and stays too long. My husband leaned close and whispered that everyone seemed nervous, and I smiled and said people behave differently when they finally understand the room, and he laughed softly, unaware that he had been the lesson all along. The final closure came not with confrontation but with absence, invitations we declined, calls unanswered, lives diverging naturally once illusions died, and I felt no triumph, only peace, because revenge isn't loud when it's done right, it's quiet, permanent, and undeniable. Years later, when someone new asked how my family reacted to my marriage, I said they learned, and when asked what they learned, I said never mistake humility for weakness, never mock what you don't understand, and never assume the quietest person at the table lacks power, because sometimes the smallest presence carries the heaviest consequences. And as my husband squeezed my hand, smiling at nothing and everything, I knew the greatest revenge wasn't what they lost. It was what we built. Unshaken, unseen, and forever beyond their reach. Time moved forward the way it always does, pretending neutrality while favoring those who prepared for it, and my family continued orbiting the consequences they never fully named, because naming a mistake gives it shape, and shape gives it ownership. And ownership was the one thing they avoided with discipline. My husband and I built our life deliberately, not loud enough to invite envy, not small enough to invite dismissal, a balance learned through scars rather than advice, and in that balance I discovered a new kind of strength, the kind that doesn't need witnesses. Occasionally, fragments of the old mockery surfaced in rumors that reached us through distant relatives, distorted retellings where my family painted themselves as misunderstood victims of sudden misfortune, and I let them have that story. Because people cling to narratives the way drowning men cling to wreckage, and pulling it away would only prolong the struggle. My husband noticed those moments when my jaw tightened at a careless comment from someone unaware of history, and he would squeeze my hand, grounding me again, reminding me silently that the past no longer had jurisdiction over our present. One evening, while sorting through old photos, we came across an image from that first dinner, frozen smiles, raised glasses, eyes sharp with judgment, and my husband studied it quietly before saying he barely remembered what was said that night. Only how determined I looked when we left, and I realized then that pain fades differently depending on where it lands, and his had never rooted itself, because he never accepted their verdict in the first place. That realization softened something in me, because I had carried the memory like a blade, while he had let it pass like weather, and both responses had been necessary, but only one was light enough to keep. My cousin eventually resurfaced publicly, attempting a comeback, louder this time, desperate to reclaim relevance through spectacle, and the world watched briefly before moving on, because desperation is exhausting to witness. And I felt a quiet sadness rather than satisfaction, not because I regretted what happened, but because some people never learn that dignity cannot be manufactured after it's been discarded. My mother aged faster than time alone could explain, lines deepening from thoughts she never voiced, and when we spoke, conversations stayed safe and shallow, the intimacy of certainty replaced by the caution of distance, and though part of me mourned that loss, another part understood that relationships rebuilt on truth are fewer but stronger, and illusions had been doing the heavy lifting before. My husband remained my constant, not as a symbol or shield, but as a partner who saw me fully and chose me daily, and that choice mattered more than any apology I never received. One night, long after the echoes of mockery had faded into background noise, he asked me if I ever wished things had gone differently, if peace could have come without consequences, and I told him the truth. That peace without boundaries is just silence waiting to be broken, and that sometimes consequences are the language people understand when words fail. He nodded, thoughtful, and said he was glad I stood up for us, and in that simple sentence was everything my family had never given him, recognition without conditions. As years layered over the past, the story shifted again, no longer about revenge but about legacy, about what we passed forward instead of what we reacted to, and I realized the final evolution of revenge is irrelevance. When those who once mattered no longer occupy space in your decisions. At a gathering years later, a younger relative asked how I learned confidence, expecting a glamorous answer, and I told her confidence grows when you stop explaining your worth to people committed to misunderstanding it, and my husband smiled, because that lesson had been written in him long before I learned to read it. The world never applauded the moment my family lost their grip on us. There was no dramatic reveal, no public reckoning, only a quiet shift where power changed hands and stayed there, and that was enough. In the end, my family never knew the full extent of what they triggered that night, never traced the line between a careless laugh and a lifetime recalibrated, and maybe that was mercy, because understanding it fully would have required facing who they were. And not everyone survives that confrontation. What mattered was this, that the man they mocked slept peacefully beside me every night, unburdened by their opinions, and the woman they underestimated learned exactly how strong love can make you when it stops asking for permission. The years that followed settled into something solid and unshakable, the kind of life that doesn't glitter on the surface, but holds weight underneath, and that weight was built from choices made quietly, consistently, without witnesses. And sometimes I wondered if my family felt it from a distance the way people feel pressure change before a storm. My husband grew more confident not because he needed to prove anything, but because safety allows people to expand naturally, and I watched him speak more, laugh louder, take up space without apology, and every time he did, it felt like a private victory written just for us. News from my family arrived less often, filtered through others, softened by time, but always carrying the same undertone of regret disguised as nostalgia, stories of how things used to be before everything changed, as if change itself were the villain rather than the behavior that demanded it. My aunt's health declined, stress carving paths medicine couldn't erase, and when she reached out, her voice trembling, asking if we could visit, I agreed without hesitation, not because I forgot, but because forgiveness is not the same as access, and I could forgive without reopening doors. At her bedside, she apologized finally, not with excuses, not with laughter, but with tears, admitting she had mistaken gentleness for insignificance, and my husband held her hand while she cried, because compassion had always been his language. And watching him, I realized the most devastating response to cruelty is not retaliation, but grace offered from a position of strength. Afterward, as we drove home, I asked him if it hurt to be kind to people who had hurt him, and he said no, because carrying anger requires believing the other person still has power over you. And that sentence stayed with me longer than any insult ever had. My cousin faded from relevance completely, his name becoming something people mentioned with vague sympathy before changing the subject, and I understood then that social death is often quieter than public failure, and far more final. My mother and I found a careful rhythm, built on mutual respect rather than expectation, and though it lacked warmth, it held honesty, and honesty, I learned, is sometimes the highest form of reconciliation available. One evening, sitting on our balcony watching the city dim into night, my husband asked if I ever felt guilty about how things unfolded, and I answered without hesitation that I felt responsible, not guilty. Because responsibility means acknowledging your role without assuming blame for other people's choices. He smiled and said that was why he trusted me, because I knew the difference between power and cruelty, and hearing that felt like absolution I didn't know I was seeking. The memory of that first dinner no longer burned. It existed now as reference, a marker of how far we had come, and when I replayed it in my mind, I no longer saw mockery. I saw fear disguised as superiority, insecurity dressed in silk. And that reframing stripped the scene of its power completely. Younger members of my family began reaching out privately, asking questions about life, about work, about confidence, and I answered them carefully, knowing cycles only break when someone chooses to interrupt them instead of inherit them. And if my family's legacy was going to change, it would be through quiet corrections, not dramatic revolutions. My husband became someone people sought advice from, drawn to his calm, his clarity, his refusal to posture, and I watched the world respond to him the way it always eventually does to authentic strength, with respect earned slowly and kept fiercely. The final realization came one morning as we planned a future trip, laughing over maps and possibilities, when I understood that revenge had long since completed its arc and transformed into something else entirely: freedom. The freedom to build without looking back, to love without defense, to exist without explanation, and in that moment, I knew my family had never truly lost anything tangible. What they lost was the privilege of knowing us deeply. And that loss would follow them longer than any consequence I orchestrated, because some absences echo louder than punishment ever could. The quiet after that realization felt expansive, like standing at the edge of something vast without needing to name it, and from that place our lives continued unfolding with a steadiness that no longer needed contrast to feel meaningful. My husband's presence became the center of our home, not because he demanded it, but because calm naturally gathers attention, and people entering our space often left lighter than they arrived, as if something unspoken had been restored. I noticed how strangers listened when he spoke, how interruptions stopped around him, how respect formed without effort, and it struck me that the very traits my family mocked had matured into influence, the kind that doesn't shout but still moves rooms. Occasionally, someone from my past would attempt a casual reconnection, pretending time had erased context, and I learned to respond with politeness that revealed nothing, because access is not owed to familiarity. And history alone doesn't earn a place in the present. My family gatherings grew smaller, quieter, stripped of performance, and though they lacked the old noise, they carried a new weight, the weight of caution, of lessons learned too late, and I watched them interact with my husband now with measured respect, aware that their earlier cruelty had cost them something irretrievable. My husband never gloated, never corrected, never reminded, and in that restraint lay the final mirror they were forced to face, because dignity makes cruelty look childish in retrospect. One afternoon, a relative admitted privately that the family had underestimated us both, that they never imagined we would build something so stable, so enduring, and I thanked them without comment, because validation loses value when it arrives after truth has already been proven. At home that evening, my husband asked why I looked thoughtful, and I told him I was realizing how little I needed their understanding anymore, and he smiled and said understanding is overrated, consistency matters more, and I laughed, because he had been teaching me that lesson quietly for years. The world outside continued its chaos. Fortunes rose and fell, reputations bloomed and withered, but inside our life there was rhythm, shared routines, small rituals that mattered more than milestones. And I recognized that this was the success my family never knew how to measure. Sometimes, late at night, I imagined an alternate version of that first dinner, one where kindness replaced mockery, curiosity replaced judgment, and I realized how different everything might have been, not better or worse, just different. And that acceptance closed a door I didn't realize was still ajar. The younger relatives who watched from the margins began making different choices, choosing partners with character over appearance, substance over noise, and when they asked me how I knew what mattered, I pointed to my husband. Because examples speak louder than explanations ever could. Years later, when my mother's voice softened with age and regret, she admitted she wished she had defended him that night, and I told her the truth, that defending him wouldn't have changed who he was, but it might have changed who she became, and she nodded, understanding finally landing without resistance. My husband held my hand through that conversation, steady as always, and afterward he told me he never blamed her, because blame assumes expectation, and he had learned long ago not to expect decency from people who fear humility. As time continued its quiet work, The story of our lives simplified, stripped of old conflicts, leaving only what endured, love built on trust, strength built on patience, and a peace that didn't require anyone else's approval. And I understood then that the truest revenge was not the fall of those who mocked us, but the rise of a life so full, so grounded, that their absence no longer felt like loss, only space finally put to good use. That space kept expanding, not outward in spectacle, but inward in certainty, and with each passing season I felt less like someone who had survived something and more like someone who had simply arrived where she was always meant to stand. My husband's work evolved quietly, opportunities finding him without pursuit, because integrity has a way of attracting doors that ambition alone cannot force open. And I watched him navigate success with the same gentleness he once used to navigate dismissal, unchanged at the core, and that consistency became our compass. When recognition came, it came sideways, through respect rather than applause, through trust rather than titles, and I saw how deeply it unsettled those who once believed loudness was power, because nothing threatens fragile hierarchies like calm authority. My family's interactions with us settled into careful civility, and though warmth never fully returned, hostility never dared resurface, as if some unspoken rule had been written and silently enforced, and I understood then that boundaries, once established, educate better than confrontation ever could. On a quiet anniversary night, as we shared a simple meal at home, my husband asked me what I remembered most vividly from that first dinner years ago. And I surprised myself by answering that I remembered the moment I stopped waiting for permission to protect what mattered, because that was the instant my life shifted direction. He smiled and said he remembered trusting me completely without knowing why, and that trust, he said, had been the safest place he'd ever stood. And hearing that reframed everything, because revenge may have been the spark, but trust was the foundation that carried us forward. Occasionally, echoes of the past surfaced unexpectedly, a joke overheard at another table, a careless comment about worth or appearance, and instead of anger, I felt clarity, recognizing how many people live imprisoned by shallow metrics, and how free we had become by rejecting them entirely. The younger generation in my family grew bolder in questioning old assumptions, and though no one ever credited us directly, I could see the ripple, subtle but real, and that knowledge brought a quiet satisfaction that revenge alone never could. My husband remained uninterested in being a symbol, but he became one anyway, proof that strength does not need spectacle, that dignity compounds over time, and that humility paired with resolve is not weakness, but discipline. When people asked how we maintained such steadiness, I learned to answer simply, we chose each other daily, even when no one was watching, especially when no one was watching, and that truth felt like the final seal on a chapter that no longer needed continuation. Looking back now, the mockery that once cut so deeply feels almost instructive, a harsh teacher that revealed who deserved access to our lives and who never truly did, and I no longer wish it undone, because without it, I might never have recognized the depth of my own capacity to protect, to build, to endure. In the end, my family never apologized in the way stories often demand. There was no grand confession or public redemption, only altered behavior and softened eyes, and that was enough, because growth rarely announces itself. What remained was a life anchored in mutual respect, love untested by cruelty anymore, and a certainty that the smallest person at the table is often the one holding the most power, not because they seek it, but because they never needed it to know who they are. As the years layered themselves gently over us, I noticed how rarely I thought about that night anymore, not because it had lost meaning, but because its lesson had been fully absorbed, integrated into the way I moved through the world without hesitation or apology. My husband became my measure for people now, not in comparison but in clarity. If someone lacked kindness under pressure, humility and strength, or loyalty when unobserved, I knew exactly how far they belonged in my life. Invitations came and went, alliances formed and dissolved, but we remained selective, understanding that peace is not found in abundance of company, but in the quality of presence, and that discernment felt like wealth my family never taught me to value. Occasionally, My family attempted to rewrite the past in softer tones, telling stories where the cruelty was mutual or the mockery misunderstood, and I let them. Because correcting history mattered less than controlling the future, and the future was already ours. My husband once overheard a distant relative refer to him with respect so exaggerated it bordered on fear, and he laughed later, saying it felt strange to be seen as something he never tried to become. And I told him that power often arrives disguised as inevitability when you live honestly long enough. There were moments, quiet and unremarkable, that felt more victorious than any confrontation could have, mornings when sunlight filled our kitchen and laughter came easily, evenings when silence felt companionable rather than tense. And I understood that these were the moments my family unknowingly forfeited when they chose judgment over curiosity. As my parents aged, their world shrank, priorities simplified, and when vulnerability replaced arrogance, I met it with steadiness rather than resentment, because by then I no longer needed their validation to feel whole. My husband stood beside me through every interaction, never pushing, never retreating, simply present, and that presence rewrote my understanding of partnership as something grounded rather than performative. One afternoon, while helping a younger relative through a difficult decision, I heard myself repeating words my husband had once said to me about not mistaking noise for importance, and I smiled, realizing how influence spreads quietly through consistency rather than proclamation. The story of our lives continued without dramatic twists, and that was its triumph, because stability after chaos is not boring, it is earned. When I finally understood that revenge had long since dissolved into wisdom, I felt no loss, only gratitude, because anger had served its purpose and stepped aside gracefully. The people who mocked my husband never truly recovered what they lost, not status or comfort, but proximity to something genuine, and that absence lingered in their lives like an echo they could never trace. In the end, nothing needed to be said aloud, because the truth had been lived thoroughly, and as my husband rested his head against mine one quiet evening, I knew with certainty that the most powerful response to cruelty is a life built so well that it leaves no room for regret, only understanding that some lessons arrive wrapped in pain, but remain as strength forever. Eventually, even memory softened into texture rather than weight, something felt rather than carried, and that was when I knew the story had crossed its final threshold, no longer a response to anything, but simply a life moving forward with intention. My husband's laughter grew easier, fuller, the kind that comes from safety rather than performance, and I realized how deeply environment shapes people, how cruelty compresses and love allows expansion. And watching him thrive confirmed that nothing about him had ever been small except the way others tried to see him. The family dynamics stabilized into something distant but functional, birthdays acknowledged, milestones noted, conversations respectful but restrained, and though it lacked intimacy, it held peace, and peace, I learned, is sometimes the highest achievable harmony after damage has been done. When relatives spoke of the past now, they did so carefully, choosing words as if handling fragile glass, and that caution was itself a confession, because people only tread lightly around truths that still burn. My husband never demanded acknowledgement, never asked for apologies, and in that refusal he claimed something far greater than vindication. He claimed sovereignty over his own worth. At times I wondered what my family told themselves late at night, whether regret visited them quietly the way it once visited me, or whether pride still negotiated with memory to preserve comfort. But those questions lost urgency as my own life filled with meaning that required my attention. New challenges arose, as they always do, but we met them together, not as a united front against others, but as partners aligned toward growth, and that distinction mattered, because unity born from love is far stronger than unity forged by opposition. I caught glimpses of my former self occasionally, the woman who once sat at that table absorbing laughter like blows, and I felt compassion for her rather than anger, because she had endured long enough to become someone capable of choosing differently. The narrative my family once tried to impose dissolved completely, replaced by reality too consistent to deny, and though they never named their mistake outright, they lived around it, adjusting their behavior to accommodate the truth they avoided saying. In quiet moments, I thanked that first spark of anger for showing me where my boundaries lived, then released it fully, because anger that has done its work deserves rest. My husband became not just my partner, but my mirror, reflecting back the woman I had grown into, strong without hardness, firm without cruelty, decisive without malice, and loving without fear. And that reflection mattered more than any triumph I once imagined. When people now ask about resilience, about overcoming judgment or betrayal, I tell them it begins the moment you stop trying to prove your worth to those committed to misunderstanding it, and instead build a life so aligned with your values that their opinions lose gravity. The mockery that once defined a night became a footnote in a much larger story, a catalyst rather than a scar, and as I look forward rather than back, I know with certainty that the greatest revenge was never about what my family lost, but about what we refuse to lose: our dignity, our unity, our peace, and our unwavering belief that love chosen daily is the most unassailable power there is. The future unfolded without ceremony, days stacking into years with a quiet reliability that once would have felt impossible, and I learned that healing often disguises itself as routine, as normalcy slowly replacing vigilance. My husband and I grew older together in the best ways, wiser without bitterness, stronger without armor, and the confidence he carried now was not something gained, but something reclaimed. The natural posture of a man finally allowed to exist without judgment pressing him inward. Occasionally, a stranger would underestimate him the way my family once did, mistaking softness for weakness, and I would watch calmly as reality corrected them without intervention, because truth does not need defenders when it is lived consistently. My family's presence in our lives became seasonal, predictable, no longer capable of disruption, and though some part of me once wished for a clearer resolution, I eventually understood that closure is not always a conversation. Sometimes it is simply the absence of pain where it once lived. My husband never spoke of that night unless asked, and even then, his recollection was factual rather than emotional, as if the event had been catalogued and shelved, its purpose fulfilled, and I admired that ability, because it meant the past held no leverage over his present. As we built new traditions, our own rituals, our own definitions of success, I realized how deeply my family's values had once shaped my fears, and how freeing it was to release standards that were never designed to honor people like him, or people like me. Younger relatives continued to seek guidance, sensing safety where judgment once ruled, and I answered honestly, encouraging discernment over obedience, self-respect over approval, and watching them choose differently felt like a quiet correction rippling outward. The mockery that once echoed so loudly now felt distant, almost unreal, like a story told about someone else, and when I thought about it at all, it was with gratitude for the clarity it forced upon me. My husband and I stood together one evening watching the horizon darken, hands linked, silence comfortable, and I understood then that nothing had truly been taken from us that night. Instead, something essential had been revealed: the depth of our bond, the strength of our values, and the certainty that we could withstand judgment without becoming it. In the end, my family never fully knew who my husband was, not because he hid himself, but because they never learned how to see beyond their own assumptions, and that limitation remained theirs to carry, not ours. What endured was simple and profound: a life built on mutual respect, patience earned through hardship, and love that did not need to announce itself to be felt, and that, more than anything else, was the ending they never saw coming. And still the story moved, not toward spectacle but toward depth, because lives that survive judgment tend to grow roots instead of wings, and roots hold longer. My husband became someone whose presence steadied others without effort, the kind of man people trusted instinctively, not because he demanded belief, but because his consistency left no room for doubt. And watching that unfold felt like witnessing justice without a courtroom. My family adjusted permanently to this reality, their behavior shaped by lessons they never spoke aloud, and though they never fully crossed back into intimacy, they learned restraint, and restraint was the quiet apology they were capable of offering. I stopped wondering whether they truly understood what they had done, because understanding ceased to be necessary once it no longer affected my choices, and freedom, I learned, begins where explanation ends. My husband sometimes joked about how strange life was, how paths twist without warning, and I would smile, knowing that what looked like chance from the outside was often consequence unfolding patiently. We faced hardships like everyone does, losses, uncertainties, moments where the future blurred, but we met them with the same unity that had carried us through judgment, and that unity had been forged early, under pressure, tested before it was comfortable. And that made it resilient. In moments of reflection, I realized the revenge I once envisioned had never been about destruction. It had been about correction, about refusing to allow cruelty to define our narrative. And that refusal had altered everything quietly but irrevocably. The people who once laughed no longer laughed around us, not because they feared us, but because they finally respected the gravity of what they had underestimated, and respect, once learned the hard way, tends to linger. My husband remained uninterested in being seen as exceptional, yet exceptionalism followed him in the form of trust, loyalty, and influence that required no stage, and I understood then that true power rarely looks powerful while it is being built. As time continued its steady march, I felt gratitude replace vigilance entirely. Gratitude for the clarity pain provides, for the strength love reveals under pressure, and for the certainty that defending what matters, even silently, reshapes the future in ways confrontation never could. The dinner that once felt like a wound became a marker of transformation, the moment everything essential aligned, and from that alignment came a life that no longer needed comparison to feel complete. In the final measure, nothing my family did could diminish what we chose to build, and nothing they failed to do could undo it either, because the moment I chose my husband without reservation, without apology, without fear, the story stopped being about revenge and became about permanence, and permanence, lived well, is the most irreversible outcome of all. Permanence settled into our days like a quiet rhythm, dependable and grounding, and I learned that the greatest victories rarely announce themselves, they simply persist. My husband's confidence matured into something almost invisible, no longer a reaction to the past, but a natural state, and I realized that healing is complete not when pain disappears, but when it no longer influences your posture in the world. My family existed now at the edges of our lives, not as antagonists, not as anchors, just as distant figures who had missed their chance to know us deeply, and that absence felt neither cruel nor triumphant, only final. Sometimes, at larger gatherings, I would catch them watching us with a mixture of caution and curiosity, as if still trying to understand how quiet people built something so unshakable, and I knew they never would, because they were still looking for volume where there was only substance. My husband noticed these glances too, but they slid off him effortlessly, because he had long since stopped measuring himself through other people's eyes, and that freedom was something no one could take from him. Life continued offering lessons, some gentle, some sharp, but none felt destabilizing anymore, because our foundation had already been tested under judgment and survived. I realized that what once felt like revenge had matured into authorship, the power to define our story without footnotes written by others, and that authorship was absolute. The younger ones in my family who watched quietly began mirroring our choices, valuing character over charisma, steadiness over show, and though no one ever credited us aloud, influence doesn't require acknowledgement to be real. One evening, as my husband and I sat in comfortable silence, he said something simple, that he was glad we never tried to impress anyone who laughed at us, because doing so would have cost us ourselves. And hearing that felt like the final confirmation that every choice we made had been right. The mockery that once stung no longer carried meaning. It had become evidence, proof of how shallow judgment can be, and how dangerous it is to underestimate people who move quietly. In the end, my family never saw the moment they lost their place in our lives, because it didn't happen all at once. It happened gradually, through every boundary we held, every value we honored, every time we chose peace over performance. And that was the ending they never saw coming, not humiliation, not confrontation, but a life so grounded, so complete, that their opinions faded into irrelevance, leaving behind nothing but a lesson written in silence. That love defended calmly becomes strength, and strength lived consistently becomes untouchable. The conclusion arrived without drama, without warning, without the kind of scene people expect when they imagine revenge reaching its peak, and that was precisely why they never saw it coming, because they were still waiting for noise. It happened on an ordinary day, disguised as routine, when my husband received an invitation he never sought, an offer rooted in years of quiet credibility, trust accumulated slowly from people who watched rather than judged, and when he accepted, it shifted an entire landscape my family had once believed they owned. The roles reversed so completely that no announcement was necessary. Authority simply settled where it belonged, and suddenly decisions that shaped futures passed through hands they once mocked. My family learned of it indirectly, through whispers, through news delivered carefully, and the realization hit them not as shock but as slow-burning disbelief, because the man they reduced to jokes now occupied a position they could never reach again. They never confronted us about it, never congratulated us openly, because doing so would require admitting the truth they had avoided for years, that they were wrong not just about him, but about everything they believed power looked like. The final irony was gentle but absolute. My husband used his influence not to exclude, not to retaliate, but to open doors for others like him, people overlooked, underestimated, quietly capable. And in doing so, he reshaped systems my family once relied on to feel superior. They felt the change without understanding its source, opportunities narrowing, access shifting, respect no longer automatic, and for the first time they experienced what it meant to exist in a world that did not bend for them. When my mother finally asked me how this happened, not with accusation but with weary honesty, I told her the truth in one sentence: "You taught me to survive, but he taught me how to build," and in that moment I saw the full weight of understanding land. Too late to change the past, just in time to feel its cost. My husband never spoke of victory, never acknowledged the reversal, because to him it wasn't revenge, it was alignment, life settling into its rightful order once noise stepped aside. And as we stood together at the end of that long arc, looking not backward but forward, I understood the final truth, that the greatest revenge is not proving others wrong, but living so fully, so deliberately, that their judgment becomes irrelevant, their mockery meaningless, and their presence optional. They never saw it coming because they were too busy looking down, and by the time they looked up, we were no longer in their line of sight at all.